Thank you. Thrilled to be here today as well. Yeah, the name of my podcast is Talking Talmud. It's a really accessible podcast about on Daf Yomi every day. It doesn't review the whole daf, but instead gives you a couple of things to think about on the daf with me and my chavruta Ann Gordon. I'm thrilled to see people from all over the world here, from Prague. Someone said they're in Pennsylvania. I'm actually in Pennsylvania too, camp doctoring in Camp Moshava for the summer. So I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to get to a lot of fun stuff on this week's, on this week. So the first thing that I just want to point out is if you are following Daf Yomi, a part of the past week, Kuf Yud Aleph is actually a third of the way through of the cycle of Daf Yomi. So I just sort of wanted to point that out to everybody, that we're a third of the way there, and that is pretty exciting. But what I'm going to get to is a couple of passages that start on Kuf Yud Gimel. And I'm really just going to, Kuf Yud Bet even, I'm really just going to go through a couple of points to think a little bit about how the daf is actually structured and a couple of interesting things that are mentioned on the daf. We're basically wrapping up the Masachet of Yevamot now. There's about 10 dafim left once we get to Kuf Yud Bet. It goes up to 122 pages. And, you know, we're now getting into a bunch of other areas about marriages and particularly the issue of testimony and how does testimony actually work? How do we believe people? And I think that's a very fascinating topic because part of what we see on these dafim is sort of a lot of assumptions that Chazal, the Tanaim and the Amoraim make about how people speak, what are their attitudes going in towards a marriage or their attitudes towards wanting to get out of a marriage. And therefore they pay very close attention to how people speak and, you know, thinking about whether or not they say something that sort of reveals the truth or reveals an ulterior motive. So those are some of the things that I want to highlight with you today. And also, please feel free to just pop a question into the chat. I will check it a little bit. As I just did now. So if you have a question, you can let me know. So we have a new parak here that starts on Kuf Yud Bet. And one of the things that's really interesting about this parak is it actually presents a bunch of mishnayos. So this is a structural thing that I wanted to point out to everybody. Often the way that the Gemara, the Talmud is structured is we have 6 Siddharim of Mishnah, right? There are 6 sort of like huge books of Mishnah. Then with each Seder, there's different Masechta, which we could sort of describe as, I guess the way that I would look at it is it's like the Seder is like all of Harry Potter. Each Masechet is a book within Harry Potter. And then within each Masechet, there are different prakim, there are different chapters. The way that the Gemara is generally structured is that we have a parak, we learn one Mishnah, right, which is Tanaitic literature. And then there's a whole series of Amoraic discussion, which is the Gemara piece on that particular Mishnah. This parak that starts with Kuf Yud Bet is interesting. And again, this is just a structural thing. We're not going to read all the Mishnah. And we see this occasionally. It presents all the Mishnah of that parak as one large unit, instead of actually splitting them up into their smaller Mishnahs. And so that's sort of just an interesting stylistic thing to see. So when you open up this parak, you're going to see, and here I'm showing you on Sefaria, it's paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of Mishnah, basically, right? This is all Mishnah. We haven't even gotten to the Gemara yet, and it's really not one big Mishnah, but essentially what it is it's a series of Mishnayos that come together that instead of going through one parak by itself. So I just wanted to sort of point out a stylistic thing that happens with some of these prakim. We'll see that occasionally. It's not particularly common, but it does happen a little bit. Now, the first area that I want to read actually with you in terms of text is a discussion about ketubot. It's a discussion about marriage contracts. Now, we're going to see more of this in the next Masechet that we're going to get to in our study of Daf Yomi. Once we finish Yevamot, we get to an entire Masechet called Ketuvot, which is all about the Ketubot, which is all about the marriage contract. But we start to see here a little bit of hints about what actually the ketubah does. And I think it's really important to discuss it because I'm actually very active in solving the aguna problem, right, which is a problem today about women being able to get an equitable divorce and to get their get in a timely fashion. But I also want to point out that the whole system of ketubah, right, of this idea of having a marriage contract was actually one of basically creating prenuptial agreements. It's really a prenuptial agreement that guaranteed women a certain amount of money, either within the marriage or upon the dissolution of the marriage itself. And so we start to see some of that being discussed in these final prakim of Yevamot. Now, one thing that may make us a little bit uncomfortable is part of what this parak discusses in the previous parak is this idea of marriage with a katana, this idea of marriage with a minor. And this was really, again, and I want to point this out, it was an economic thing that was done. Let's say a man died and he leaves behind a widow and sons, and they had a minor daughter. What they would often do is they would betroth her to a man so that when she becomes an adult, she's already sort of married and taken care of, and there would be some economic support to her when she was already a minor. Now, today, to modern learners, this is really pretty appalling. I think many of us sort of have images of some of the things that have gone on in Afghanistan with the Taliban. But I really want to make clear that, first of all, they didn't actually enter into a sexual relationship at all until she was actually an adult. And second of all, really, this was an economic protection that was there for a family that probably could not afford to take care of everybody in that family once the father actually passed away. So one of the things the Gemara actually wants to discuss here is why is it that a ketana would have a ketubah and a woman who is a chayreshet, who is a deaf mute, does not have a ketubah. And again, I'm pointing out this passage because I think these are the types of things that when we learn as modern learners, really sort of are like, this is the part of the Gemara that feels very icky, right? Why is it that a person who a chayreshet, right, a chayresh, which would basically be described as a deaf mute, would not get a ketubah? And the whole halachic category of a deaf mute is a very interesting halachic category because part of what's questioned there is that this is probably a person who was unable to communicate. And it's very, very different than today, the category of somebody who's actually deaf or mute. Today, we have so many different ways that people can communicate, whether it's through sign language, whether it's through technology-aided devices like a tablet, for example. I'm sure many of you have seen that. And so part of the reason why the Chareshet in the time of the Gemara has sort of a different halachic category is it's a question about whether or not they can communicate in a way and, are they actually of sound mind? And if they're not of sound mind, because again, they could not communicate with the typical Chareshet, then then how can you make them obligated into certain mitzvot? How could they enter into a marriage? And so the status of a deaf mute who gets married, they understand that they can have kedushin, and this will get discussed more in kedushin, but the question is, do they have the same rights to a marriage that they would get a ketubah? And so the Gemara basically asks, Umay shna katana de'isle ketubah, umay shna chayreshet de'leisle ketubah. What is the difference between a minor girl that she would get a marriage contract and a deaf mute woman that she would not have a marriage contract? Di'im kain mimini v'li nasavi lei. Because the Gemara answers, the reason is, right, that if a husband of this deaf mute woman would be obligated to give her a marriage contract, he actually would not marry her at all. And so part of what we see the Gemara parse out here is they actually recognize they want to get as many people sort of into marriages as possible. And again, not because of sort of, let's say, our modern 21st century value that we love people to get married, but because marriage came with certain economic benefits. It was really the only way that a woman could sort of function in society. It was the primary way that she would be taken care of. And so here they have a category of somebody with a presumed disability who has difficulty communicating in that world. And in order to encourage those marriages, it actually was more beneficial for her not to have a ketubah. And so the Gemara goes on to say, Gutana nalan de'isla ketubah. So where do we learn that a minor girl does get a ketubah? And so here they quote a Mishnah from Bava Metzia, Ditnan, Hamima'enet, V'hashniya, V'hal Yonit, ein lahen ketubah. There's 3 women, right, who do not get a ketubah. A minor who refuses to marry her husband, right? So in other words, if a minor is put into one of these by her mother or brothers to marry a man, and then when she gets older, she would enter into a full marriage, she actually has a right of refusal. But if she refuses, she does not collect her ketubah, okay? Also a secondary forbidden relative. So these were, besides the what we call the araya, the forbidden relatives who are listed in the Torah, in order to protect those types of relationships from not happening, there's a whole series of shniyot, of secondary forbidden relations by rabbinic law. And if they enter into a marriage, right, because again, it's rabbinic law, it's not Torah law, that kedushin, that marriage will stand, but they would not collect a ketubah. And a sexually underdeveloped woman. So the whole category of nilonid is a very interesting category, but the presumption is it's entering into a marriage with a woman who could not bear children. And since part of the purpose of marriage was to have children, to fulfill that biblical commandment of pru revu, right, of be fruitful and multiply, she would not have a marriage contract. Now, again, what's interesting is these are not saying that these marriages can't happen, but it's just saying they don't get some of the rights of marriage, particularly the economic right of the ketubah, right? Aval yotza beget uktana yesh la ketubah. So what we infer from this Mishnah is that a woman who is divorced by a get, she would always collect her ketubah, and a minor girl would be entitled to a ketubah. So now for a deaf mute woman, how do we know she doesn't get a ketubah? Tanya, and so now we have a brisa. So we have a deaf mute woman or a woman of some impaired intellectual capacity who marries we're talking about a deaf mute man or an intellectually impaired man who marries what's considered to be a competent woman. In other words, a woman who doesn't have any disability at all, right? And then we say, let's say the deaf mute man actually regains his full ability to communicate. The nishtapa hashoteh, or let's say the person who was the shoteh also regains his intellectual capacity. Ein lahem aleihem klum. Their wives have no claim of anything against them. In other words, they really cannot get their ketubot from them. Ratzula kaiman. But if the men want to maintain these women, in other words, once they are a full pikeach, once they're fully competent, they do have to actually have a marriage contract with them. And let's say a mentally competent man who marries a chereshet or a shotah woman, afilu katavla mea mana, even if he writes her a ketubah of 100 dinars, ketubata kayemet, her ketubah is valid, because he wanted to harm his own property. In other words, if he writes this ketubah, right, he did it willingly and it upholds. But the point is that he actually was not obligated to do so. So when he gives her ketubah, it's actually like a person who harms himself financially, right? Tama deratza, what would be the reason that he would want to write her this ketubah? Ha lo ratza, right? So what we infer from there is that actually, if he didn't want to write one, ain less, she wouldn't have a ketubah and that would be fine. Because again, the logic here is we want to encourage that a woman who is a chereshet or a woman who's a shotah could get married, but we need to make it, the rabbis felt that the ketubah actually could have been sort of a financial stumbling block to having these types of marriages happen. So again, I know that some of the descriptions of people here may wrinkle, and not feel good to our modern learners, but I do think it's really important to recognize that, the Chazal, the rabbis were very invested in sort of making these marriages work. And again, part of what's going on here is they're paying attention to what are the assumptions or how do people feel about these types of situations. And so the assumption is that a woman who is a chereshet or a shota is not going to be as marriageable, right? Or economically, at least, they'll be more of a burden. And so therefore, to encourage those marriages, we will not have a ketubah. And I think, again, what we're seeing is sort of these assumptions that Chazal make into understanding, how should marriage law work? This is not based on any, verses that are in the Torah itself. It's really based on Chazal's understanding of human nature. I'm just going to check the chat quickly to see if there are any questions here. Okay, so thank you, Robin, for telling me my podcast, and Neri for telling me that my podcast is great. Okay, so Emily said, wonder about the definition of sound mind. Would someone with depression or mania or OCD be considered of sound mind? So I think those are excellent questions. These are things that the halacha is just starting to grapple with. There's a rabbi in Israel named Rav Yoni Rosenzweig who actually just came out with a first sefer on issues of mental illness and halacha. And I think halacha is just because we are much more sophisticated in our understanding of these types of issues. And so I think we are entering a period of time where these things are going to be thought out a little bit more clearly than they have been in previous centuries. So it's an excellent book. It's only out in Hebrew. And now, of course, I'm blanking on the name of the book. If anybody remembers it, you can drop it in the chat. So I think, yes, today an argument could be made, right? But again, I don't think any rabbi would say that you wouldn't marry with a ketubah today. Today we get married with a ketubah. But that would be an interesting question, sort of to Chazal back then. Would our current understanding of mental illness put somebody in the category of a shotah? Again, a shotah today in modern Hebrew has a very different connotation. So I'm using it as the halachic category that we say here. Sal wanted to ask her, is there not a Gemara which states a man who marries without a ketubah in order to own financial obligation, we impose ketubah? Yes, that is absolutely true. And that's something that we'll say in the ketubah. But again, these are categories of people who we want to make sure that they can get married. And there's a question that actually the ketubah may be a hindrance as opposed to actually so we take away the ketubah to make sure that this category of people can actually get married. Okay, now we're going to move on to another Gemara on Daf Kuf Yud Dalet. And I love this Gemara because I think it actually sort of shows a very, very modern example of things that go on with families today. The Gemara is in the midst of a discussion about whether or not you have to prevent a katan, a minor, from actually committing a chait, from committing a sin. And so it brings a variety of different halachic examples of, do we have to prevent a minor from actually sinning, or can we not? And certainly we shouldn't encourage them to sin, but if we see them in the middle of an act, we have to actually stop them. And the Gemara brings two interesting teachings that I think are very, very relevant to today. Toshma ben chaver sheragil leilech etzel abi imo am haaretz. So we have a category here of a chaver, and what a chaver is the rabbis basically acknowledged that there were different types of religious observance, and a chaver was a person who was particularly meticulous about certain areas of halacha, especially around tuma and tara, laws of purity and impurity, and the laws around truma and maser, right? Truma and maser were the tais, were the gifts that were given to the Kohanim and to the Leviim, and also some of those tais had to be brought up to Jerusalem to be eaten, and there were also tais that had to be given to the poor. And those were the areas of halacha that they were very careful about, and those they were called a chaver. So let's say you have the son of a chaver who often goes to his maternal grandfather's house, and that maternal grandfather, right, haaretz. He is an am haaretz. Now today, am haaretz in modern Hebrew has a very negative connotation, which is one of basically being sort of an ignoramus. But for the rabbis, all of that category meant is you just were a person who wasn't particularly careful about these laws, but it didn't mean that you were a bad person. So the halachic question here is, what do you do about a minor child of a chaver who wants to go visit his am haaretz grandfather? And the idea being is that obviously he's going to go to his grandfather's house. What do grandparents love to do? At least my grandparents. They love to feed their Jewish grandchildren, right? But we're concerned that this minor is going to be fed food that Truma and Maser was not taken appropriately from. What does the Gemara say? We don't worry about it. We don't worry about that he's going to be fed that kind of food. Let's say his chaver father comes to pick him up and he sees a piece of fruit in the grandson's hand. Ein zakuklo, right? He doesn't have to take truma and maser from it, the chaver father. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, b'damai hekilu. So Rabbi Yochanan says this is only the case if we know we're dealing with damai, which is produce that we're not sure if truma and maser was taken from, but not produce that we would call tevel, which for sure we know that truma and maser is taken from. So that's the first example. There's a little bit more discussion about what Rabbi Yochanan actually means. We're going to skip that. Second teaching, Toshma, ben chaver kohen shiragili lech etzel avimo kohen am haaretz. So now the case is a chaver kohen who would therefore be, remember the kohanim get to eat truma. You are not allowed to eat tamei truma. That's a big no-no. You have to burn it, okay? So his son goes to his maternal grandfather kohen, right? Who's anam haaretz. So therefore he's not so careful to make sure that he only eats tamei truma. Again, we don't worry that that child is going to eat tamei truma. Matzah biyado perod. Again, we find the father goes to pick his son up from his father-in-law's house. He finds fruit in the son's hand. Ein zakukla. We don't have to worry about it. He doesn't have to take it out of his hand. But truma derabanan, right? Because this would be basically truma that we would separate by rabbinic law. In other words, you would have to double separate it, and we're not worried about it. I think this is a fascinating passage, right? I think many of us are members of families where there is a variety of levels of observance. And the Gemara's solution here is not that we don't eat in people's houses, right? The Gemara's solution is we eat in people's homes. Grandparents and grandchildren, they should be together. And not only that, even if you sort of like wanted to say you turn a blind eye, you don't sort of ask, did the grandson eat in the grandfather's house? Even if you pick the grandson up and the proof is there in his hand, you're really not supposed to do anything about this. And so I think there's a tremendous amount to learn from this particular Gemara that really teaches us how we're supposed to get along with our family members. It recognizes that families have a variety of different levels of observance, and the Gemara is completely not critical about it at all. And this is really something that I believe strongly is not a particularly a Jewish value, particularly, I guess I would identify myself as Orthodox, particularly in certain Orthodox circles. And I think we really can learn a lot from this particular Gemara. Before I go on to the last section that I want to learn with everybody, I'll just check the chat to see. Right, so Laura wrote here, respect for parents is more important than some other rules and mitzvot. Exactly, right? The point here is that making sure that this child can sort of be with his grandparents seems to be much more important than anything else. And I think, and there's multiple examples of this. There's a Mishnah in Demai, which is a Masachet. Demai is all about produce that you're unsure whether or not Truma and Maser is taken from. And there's a great example there of a chaver who wants to go eat a Yom Tov meal or a Shabbos meal with the Am Haaretz. And the Mishnah talks about, I believe it's in Perek A of Demai, and says the Mishnah talks about, the answer isn't that the assumption is the chaver is going to eat in the Am Haaretz's house. So what does he do before Shabbat? He just takes some Truma and Maser and he designates it as the Truma and Maser for the meal that he's going to eat. So we have multiple examples of this. The next thing I want to go through is a very interesting Mishnah that we have, which talks about testimony that a woman may give that her husband died, right? Let's say a woman comes back either in a time of peace or in a time, this is a new parak, right? Or in a time of war, and she says, my husband died. And she's sort of the only witness to that death. Do we believe her or do we not believe her? And so there's a very interesting opinion here at the bottom that says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Le'olam eina ne'emenet. We never believe her when she says that her husband died. Ela im came bata bocha ubigadeg kru'in. Unless she comes and she's crying and her clothes were torn. In other words, she has to look like sort of that she survived a war, or that like she's actually really upset that her husband died. Amrulo, they said to him, achad zo v'achad zo tinaseh. The rabbi said to him, this is not a good distinction, right? A woman who cries or a woman who doesn't cry can basically marry on the basis of her own testimony. And it's an interesting sort of standard that Rabbi Yehuda sort of presents, that a woman has to really look like she went through something bad and has to really look like she's mourning in order to believe her, because there's a concern that maybe she was lying. And so what follows here after this Mishnah, we're just not going to have time to go through it, but I encourage you to read it on Daf Kuf Yudalin and Kuf Tetvav, is a multitude of examples, of real life examples, where there was such and such a case that comes to a Beit Din. These were the circumstances. Do we believe the testimony or do we not believe the testimony? And what the rabbis do is they go through very carefully what the circumstances were. How did the woman express herself? Should we believe her or not believe her? But I want to just wrap up this thing. I wish we had time to go through some of those things. I want to just wrap up this little section here about Rabbi Yehuda and how this actually practically played itself out. Sorry, okay. So with Rabbi Yehuda here, we have the following. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Le'olam Eina, right? The Rabbi Yehuda says this woman is never deemed credible, basically, unless she comes crying and her clothing was torn. Amru Lola Rabbi Yehuda. So the rabbi said, according to Rabbi Yehuda, L'divarecha, right? Pikacha tinaseh, shota lo tinaseh. So they said to the rabbi, so they said a pikacha, here they mean like a woman of sound mind, she would be able to deceive because she would know, basically you now set up a system, you think it's a higher level, but any smart woman, right? Any woman who has certain intellectual abilities, she could deceive you. She could deceive the Beit Din, right? Shota lo tinaseh, and she'll be allowed to marry. But a shota, a woman with impaired intellectual abilities, she'll never be able to remarry. Maybe she doesn't express herself the same way. Maybe she wouldn't know to cry. She also wouldn't be able to scheme. So they say to Rabbi Yehuda, we don't like this standard that you created. Any type of woman who has this type of testimony, she should be allowed to remarry. And now they bring an actual case from his Beit Din, and this is fascinating. So a woman came to the Beit Din of Rabbi Yehuda. Amrile, the people come to her beforehand and they say, Svidi balech, kri'i maniach, sitri mazayach, right? Make sure that you look like you're lamenting your husband, tear your clothing and unbind your hair. In other words, you need to look like you're mourning before you go to the Beit Din. Now, I thought that this was fascinating because we know today, certainly in certain Batei Din, unfortunately that has to do with agunot, that there are certain courts that are sort of more favorable to an agunaz situation than not a situation, even let's say in the American court system, right? We sometimes know that certain judges favor certain types of cases or favor certain types of plaintiffs or favor certain types of defendants. And so here you have a group of people who live under the jurisdiction of the Beit Din of Rabbi Yehuda, and they basically want to help this woman out. So the people who go to her and say, you got to make sure you play the part because that's what's required for Rabbi Yehuda's Beit Din. Afula ha-shikra. So the Gemara says, were they telling her to lie? They don't love this story. Inu karabanan sfira lahu, right? So they say, no, the people knew that the rabbis, that basically the majority did not hold by this opinion and that she really should be permitted to marry. And therefore, Amri tavid hachi kiheche dilashuriyaha. They wanted to make sure that she would be permitted, and therefore that's why they told her to do this. And so actually, it's an amazing story because the Gemara is actually not critical of this. The Gemara is actually saying that the people did the right thing. They protected this woman. They understood that this was really a minority opinion. For whatever reason, this was the Beit Din that she was stuck going to. And they wanted to make sure that she actually was going to be allowed to marry. So I think this takes us to our time. I'll take a few more questions here. Okay, so one question here that was directed to me, which is, okay, Rob, thank you so much. The name of the book is Nafshi B'She'elati. It's not available in English yet. I'm sure it will be soon. So Sheldon wanted to ask me, what about an impaired male husband? So yes, there's a lot of discussion on these pages about how marriage law applies to him. So you can look through these past few dapim, and there's a discussion in both ways. Okay. Any other questions here? No, thank you everybody for the nice feedback. I really appreciate that. Okay, so just to summarize, we looked at a couple of structural things, the structure of a chapter that just presents all its Mishnah at the beginning, which is a little bit unusual, but we do see. And then a lot of discussion around marriage and the dissolution of marriage, which is again, not predicated on verses in the Torah, but really Chazal's understanding of under what circumstances do people prefer to enter marriage and under what circumstances do they leave marriage. And finally, we ended with two interesting types of stories, ones that I think encourages us to really get along and understand that it was a value of Chazal, that we recognize that families have different levels of observance and that we should all sort of respect those different levels and be in each other's homes. And lastly, that it's up to us as a community to protect those people who are most vulnerable. And I think we see that as an example with how the people protected this woman from the Beit Din of Rabbi Yehuda. So I always like to end a teaching with a bracha. So my blessing to us is today is that we seek out those opportunities to protect who's most vulnerable in our society, and that it's an obligation of us to do so. So thank you, everybody. Let me just see if there's, yes. Oh, so Laura wanted to know, do we often see multiple Mishnayos at the end of the Masachet? Yes. So in general, through any Masachet, the first prakim tend to be much, much longer. And then when we get to the last ones, they seem, it's almost like Chazal got a little tired. But I think what it is that sort of like the meatier discussions or whatever they need to say about that halachic topic takes place at the beginning. And by the time you get to the end of sort of some of these masachtot that let's say are 10, 12, 13 prakim, there's just a lot less to say at that point. But yes, you're totally right to notice that. And I'll stop my share here. Okay, any other questions before we finish up here? All right, well, it was great learning with you all today. I hope I will learn again with you soon. And have a wonderful day and a wonderful summer and a wonderful 4th of July for those of you who celebrate in the United States.